Good evening. It's great to see all of you here. Thanks so much for being with us. I know it's very beautiful outside, and it's very tempting to think that the JCB should hang our speakers out the front door so that we could all recline on the lawn there. Nonetheless, I'm glad that you're all here joining us in our beautiful reading room. I'm Karin Wulf. I'm the director and librarian of the JCB, and I'm so glad to be here for this wonderful event with Joyce Chaplin. Just a few comments about the library itself. Of course, the JCB is an extraordinarily powerful collection that documents the histories of the early Americas, the really foundational history of the modern world. And it's, I have a kind of patter line that I use to describe the potency of this collection and the scholarship that has been supported here at the JCB through the interpretation of those materials and also through our fellowship program. I can't help but reflect today on what those fellowships have meant, including fellowships funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has just this week been shuttered, and whose grant funding, including that to the JCB, has been eliminated. It's a rather shocking turn of events for lots of reasons. The National Endowment for the Humanities was authorized by legislation in 1965, and since 1965, has issued $6 billion in grants to fund work of scholars, but also of teachers and communities in understanding, interpreting the past and the present. I pause on that number of $6 billion since 1965 and note that the National Science Foundation budget, just the NSF, not to mention all the other agencies that fund STEM research through the federal government, but the NSF budget just last year was over $9 billion. In other words, we have purchased humanities knowledge very cheaply. And it's going to be very, very expensive to lose it. On that cheerful note, I'm so grateful for all the people and institutions, including the staff and other folks who've worked for the NEH over all those years, all the folks who have supported the work of the JCB over many decades. And I'm also very aware of how much events like this contribute to the intellectual community that has been fostered here. So, on a more cheerful note, we are particularly delighted tonight to reflect on the value of the deep historical understanding and to welcome and to celebrate and talk about Joyce Chaplin's new book, The Franklin Stove, An Unintended American Revolution. Joyce is so accomplished. I write a lot of introductions. A lot. I introduce people all the time, but I have to tell you, when I sat down to think about how to introduce Joyce, I thought, oh, this is going to be hard. Joyce is so accomplished as a historian, as a citizen of our wide intellectual communities, and as an educator. She is the James Duncan Phillips Professor of Early American History at Harvard University, where she teaches the histories of science, climate, colonialism, and environment. And she is the author or editor of exceptional scholarship, including An Anxious Pursuit, Agricultural Innovation and Modernity in the Lower South, 1730 to 1815, which was published in 1993 by the Omohundro Institute, so I feel warmly about that one in particular. So subject matter, technology, the body, and science on the Anglo-American frontier from 1500 to 1676. The First Scientific American, Benjamin Franklin and the Pursuit of Genius. Round About the Earth, Circumnavigation from Magellan to Orbit. And she's the editor of Ben Franklin's autobiography, a Norton Critical Edition. This is among other things. I say all of this to note that Joyce has been such a perceptive scholar and critic of a really deep and long chronology of American and early modern science. So her range is extraordinary and the depth of her research equally so. Her reviews and essays have appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, the New York Times Book Review, the London Review of Books, Wall Street Journal, and more. Joyce also serves on a variety of service capacities. She serves on the board for the Massachusetts Historical Society, but most importantly here, Joyce is a member of the JCB's Board of Governors, where she is a stalwart champion of the library and its mission, and for which she chairs the academic committee, meaning she helms the fellowship selection process, which is a lot of labor and also a lot of joy. And sitting in on those meetings with Joyce where she says, it's so great, we give away money to young scholars. She says that every time, and it's joyful every time. So Joyce's most recent book, which I had the joy of reading in galleys, is The Franklin Stove, as we said, for which she received a Guggenheim Fellowship, and which I'm so excited we're going to get to hear more about tonight. First, we're going to hear from Joyce, and then I'm going to get to sit on one of these, kind of, I guess, Oprah style, and have a few minutes of conversation and questions with Joyce, some questions which I've been dying to ask, and then we're going to open it up for conversation with all of you. So, Joyce.
Thank you so much, Karin, for inviting me to this wonderful event and back to the JCB for any reason. It's always a pleasure. And thank you for your comments about the NEH. As a historian of science, I belong to a community that is reeling from all of the blows to the humanities, to the sciences, and to any kind of human inquiry. It is just appalling. So I'm glad to talk about a man of science who was much more than that, but that was part of what he did. And I refer to this book, which isn't small, as everyone keeps telling me, as an essay that got out of hand. I had done a lot of work on Benjamin Franklin earlier, and I really thought I was done. I thought plenty of things to say, and I think I've said them all, and why go back into that? But I was reading for a new project on climate history. I was reading about a very bad winter, 1740 to 1741, in a series of bad winters, but this one, harbors froze over in the colonies, in Europe. Conditions were so bad in Ireland that this winter, among other things, triggered a famine that had probably a higher mortality rate than the Great Hunger of the 19th century. As much as a fifth of the population of Ireland may have died. So this was very impressive, dramatic, and I kept thinking, I know those dates from somewhere else. And it finally occurred to me that's when Franklin invented his stove, because of the cold winter. And I hadn't really talked about this in any of my earlier work on Franklin, and at first it was embarrassing. I hope no one ever would notice this. And I thought, well, no, I should admit that I missed a spot. I'll do a little essay about this connection between climate history and the history of technology through Benjamin Franklin. So I started research, and the research kept going on and on and on until I have this book that is an overgrown essay, but I think for good reasons. I'm just going to read the very, very first part of it, the very first part of the introduction that talks about what I came up with after doing this research and writing up this project. Yesterday's technology is trash. Or maybe it gets recycled, unless it goes to a museum. Those were the fates of Benjamin Franklin's famous stoves, only one of which survives and now resides in the Mercer Museum in Pennsylvania. It's roughly the size of a side table. And like many side tables today, originally came as a flat pack with instructions for assembly into what the museum describes as a cast iron stove. But it wasn't just a physical thing forged from iron. The stove was a hypothesis. Franklin was proposing that, armed with science, he and others could invent their way out of a climate crisis, creating comfortable indoor atmospheres for buyers of new stoves during a period of natural cooling, yes, the exact opposite of our problem, now called the Little Ice Age, to which the winter of 1740-41 belonged. Franklin believed that his stove could accomplish this despite another related crisis, a widespread shortage of wood fuel. And he conceived of his invention as equal parts scientific instrument and home appliance, its many iterations identifying basic principles of atmospheric science that might allow him to figure out why the climate was changing in the first place. It may seem ironic that an old wood stove is now coddled by a museum's modern HVAC system, but that's a logical outcome. The search for better heating was part of a seismic shift in material life, the most important revolution of Franklin's era, the Industrial Revolution, with its historically unique rate of burning things, eventually resulting in the artificial heating of our entire atmosphere. Given the high hopes today for inventing a way out of our own climate crisis, the history of the Franklin stove is useful, I think, even if the physical object no longer is. Physical objects, I should say, because Franklin didn't invent a stove, he invented 5 of them. He kept reinventing them over and over because he and his contemporaries were worried, like us, that 2 grim trends, climate change and resource depletion, were converging on them, with the added threat, like us, that war might at any time further compromise access to resources. Franklin lived during what historians call the Second Hundred Years' War, beginning in 1688 with the War of the League of Augsburg before Franklin's birth, and ending with the close of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 after he died, taking in the 7 Years' War and the American War for Independence along the way. So, with 5 different versions, the Franklin stove was never one single object. It was an ongoing project, preoccupying Franklin for more than half of his life, from 1738 to 1784, and eventually involving a great many other people. I love meeting these people along the way that Franklin kind of drew in, including the proprietors and workers at 3 Pennsylvania ironworks, a couple of Franklin's brothers, his London landlady and her daughter, several of the era's biggest scientific names, many aristocrats from multiple countries who liked buying the latest tech, 2 famous steam engine inventors, and the chief of police in Paris. It's from Franklin's era that we inherit our techno-optimism, a hope that a single device might solve a huge problem, silver bullet thinking. Faith in technology was part of an 18th century rage for improvement, the belief that planning and scientific knowledge could better the human condition. As an early incarnation of the charismatic scientific inventor who makes big promises, you can fill in whoever you like there, the charismatic scientific inventor who makes big promises, Franklin proposed a way to manage an emergency with a technical device whose virtues, he shrewdly hinted in his marketing materials, were uncountable, as he puts it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In his era, many improvements took the form of projects requiring investment and expertise, expected to run for certain periods and to achieve specific goals, often involving new technology. Now, we now expect even more from technology, maybe too much. Electronic consumer devices are our friends, glowing presences that make us feel autonomous and yet connected, an intoxicating combination. AI, meanwhile, is our rival, a hypothetically self-governing power that might do us in and replace us. Other new technologies are our saviors: electric cars, solar panels, heat pumps, carbon capture, geoengineering, gigantic orbiting parasols that are supposed to solve the climate crisis without our having to make any other changes to our society or economy. But all 3 of these possibilities ignore how new inventions tend to remain tethered to their human creators and users. Devices depend on the social relations around them. Their designers encode preferences into them, deliberately or inadvertently. We should ask, what gets encoded when new technology is supposed to tackle climate change, as in Franklin's era? The Little Ice Age was the biggest change in climate before our own. It was a period of interglacial cooling in the North Atlantic that lasted again roughly from 1300 to 1850. It wasn't global in extent nor caused by human beings, but its effects were sometimes devastating. People disagreed as to whether they could mitigate it, that is, actually warm up the climate. They thought it was possible, but they didn't agree that that could be done. Everyone knew, however, they had to adapt to the cold. And so, in their adaptations, including a growing reliance on science and technology, Franklin and his contemporaries conducted for us a kind of fire drill, one we can study in retrospect, seeing what worked or didn't. If the Franklin stoves were hypotheses about inventing a way out of a climate crisis, their story shows that surviving climate change is not just a technical problem. There is no magic bullet. Climate change is a social and political problem, one with a much bigger history, hence the big book, though an early and important chapter of that story conveniently fits into a device the size of a side table. I just want to wrap up by talking about these 5 stoves, which I had not realized when I started. And again, as with a lot of my books, I think in the end, if I had known what that was about, would I have done that? 5 stoves. Franklin invents 2 of these in Pennsylvania, in and around Philadelphia, originally to conserve firewood, to preserve the trees of Pennsylvania. He makes these of iron, using the Pennsylvania iron industry, the foundation of Pennsylvania's and the United States' eventual industrial prowess. He invents the last 3 stoves in Europe, and they're designed to burn coal, which does indeed save trees. That is one way to conserve wood. It's quite the trade-off, obviously. And if I had a time machine, I would want to go back and tell people, please don't start burning the coal, because here we are. That was a momentous historic step into an industrialized and non-sustainable climate. I just want to read one section of a later chapter that the chapter's called Fueled by Fossils, as Franklin is moving into this era and supporting an era where coal was being burned as a lot of other historic changes were going on. So it starts with a letter that Franklin wrote. It has the coffee cups in its belly, Franklin told his wife, packed in best crystal salt of a peculiar nice flavor. This belly belonged to a beer jug, and 1 item in 2 crates crammed with things Franklin had just bought in London and was sending home to Philadelphia. Yards of damask and sylvan cotton and carpeting, books and pamphlets and sheet music, multiple microscopes and 1 apple corer, arrays of china, glass, and silver for the table, swathes of tablecloths and napkins, plus that peculiarly tasty salt. Franklin didn't tell his wife what any of this cost, except he did, in a way. He complained in the same letter of London's terrible air, foul with coal smoke, and he described Peter, the enslaved man he'd taken with him, as behaving very well. And there we see the price of modern economic life over and across the Atlantic Ocean in 1758, when Franklin cataloged his London shopping while also documenting the era's 2 most problematic forms of energy, packed as tightly together as coffee cups inside a salt-filled beer jug. Franklin's era is distinctive and instructive, especially for us, because it had both an organic economy that still enslaved human beings and an emerging reliance on fossil fuels. Over the 2 intervals he spent in London as a colonial lobbyist in the momentous 1750s, 1760s, and 1770s, Franklin would reach different conclusions about each type of energy, accepting coal, rejecting enslavement. Franklin's final 3 heating systems, as he thought through these energy systems, would be designed to burn coal only. So his original goal of consuming minimal wood to produce maximum warmth was at this point a legacy of an older organic economy, conserving renewable resources and living within natural limits as much as possible. So, an amazing arc that Franklin's life and engagement with energy, resources, climate, how to improve human life, even when material conditions were getting worse. So a long story that extends not only into Europe, but into kind of surprising parts of Europe. And so the last thing I'm going to talk about, ending with the JCB, I promise, is the fact that in some ways the Franklin stove had its greatest afterlife in northern Italy. And again, something I had never expected. And I felt kind of personal betrayal. For complicated reasons, I had learned Italian, determined I would never use it for work or research. It was just going to be, to know Italian so that I could be in Venice where I was teaching and enjoy life. And so I did feel a personal betrayal that Franklin ends up having his stove pamphlet that described the original models from Pennsylvania into 5 Italian editions. There hadn't been even that many in Pennsylvania or anywhere else in English. So 5 Italian editions, 3 in Venice alone. And the Franklin stove's designs kept being made in northern Italy, increasingly in ceramic, not in iron, which isn't abundant in Italy. They adapted to terracotta and other ceramic. And these are made in a factory outside Turin, Castellamante, into the late 19th century, and they continue to be used, especially in public places in Italy in the early 20th century. So off I went obligingly looking at this Italian story, including finding one of these originals from the 19th century listed on Italian eBay, which is so tempting. What saved me was it wasn't complete. They didn't have all parts of it. And I stopped looking on Italian eBay when I saw a second one listed that was complete and beautiful, and I thought, just don't do it. But my biggest discovery was here at the JCB, because in some ways, Franklin's work extending into the science of heat. He explains efficient heating of a room due to convection, the tendency of air when heated to expand and rise. And he uses that principle not only to describe an optimal heating system within, but to posit that humans could create artificial atmospheres indoors into which we sit, right? We are aware, or we are always enjoying the outcome from this era of experimentation. And in some ways, what Franklin invents is not the stove, but the artificial atmosphere, which I think his scientific work, therefore, extending into explanations of the Gulf Stream, of the tendency of storms to move around. He always comes back to these original scientific principles, dutifully translated within his lifetime into 5 European languages, including these Italian editions. But it was only at the JCB that I found evidence that this stove pamphlet wasn't just a kind of entryway into the science of heat. It had practical application, because the copy at the JCB, some long dead person, God bless them, had inserted a page in which they had a diagram of how you install a Franklin stove into your house. With instructions, the translations were done in standard Italian. Thank you, Dante, for consolidating that. But the instructions were done in Venetian. Again, underlining this is practical. Somebody local really did this. So that in some ways was one of the biggest affidavits that this was a science project. It was a way of preserving the comfort of human life at a very bad moment in climate history. And it had a kind of comforting way about it that indicated actual adoption of this invention, this intervention in climate change, even as far away as Venice, Italy. So thank you, JCB, and the long ago person who not only did that diagram, but then collected it for this library. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joyce. Okay, so I have so many questions, and some of them are really basic and big. Like climate change. What's with that? No, seriously. But I think, I've been reading about the 18th century for a long time. I know a little about the Little Ice Age. I didn't think about the Little Ice Age except insofar as people who were kind of deniers of our own experience of climate change would invoke it. So could you actually zoom out a little bit for us and talk about the significance of the Little Ice Age in the history of climate change for a minute, and then I'll connect that to another question.
Yes.
Are they on? No?
There's a green light, which
There is a green light.
means that they're on, but you have to really, okay.
Okay, all right, should I ask about climate change again? All right, Joyce is gonna explain it. That's the short version here, is Joyce is going to explain climate change.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yes, the climate has been changing. The Little Ice Age was the last really significant cooling period since the big glacial period long ago, where humans did live within that. And the invention that probably came out of that earlier experience was the needle, where people were anxious that their clothing keep them warm, and the closer around your body, the better. So we moved from the flame, the heat source that had been discovered earlier by human beings, the needle, and then on to indoor heating systems. How do you stay inside and keep warm? It looks like a lot of early modern buildings were designed to keep out the rain and the wind, and that was great. But you weren't really much warmer indoors than out. And it is a kind of a new quest in the early modern period, that you would try to create good fireplaces, and possibly even entirely warmed rooms. So that's what comes out of that period of climate change. Fast forwarding to ours, well, actually, there's a connection because people are already noticing that coal smoke not only is bad to breathe and makes things ugly, but has chemical properties that seem kind of foreboding. So acid rain is discovered in the 19th century, and it's in the 1850s. The 19th century is always kind of hard for me, but in the 1850s, that an American experimenter, Eunice Foote, verified that coal smoke emission from coals had warming properties. So a sense that climate change, our climate change of anthropogenic warming, a sense that that is recent, maybe not. Because this kept being confirmed by other experimenters saying, yes, this will eventually have atmospheric consequences by the end of the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, a kind of constant, this sort of domino effect, you would think, of realizations. So I always point out that the first president briefed about global warming, as it was called then, was Johnson. Margaret Thatcher speaks at the UN feelingly about the possible ill effects of global warming. And so there's a realization in Franklin's era that keeps accumulating, using a lot of the scientific principles and ideas about chemistry and climate created in his era to eventually give the bigger realization that is not recent, but has, I think the recent history of climate change is the denialism. And the denialism has itself progressed or changed. It used to be nothing's happening. Now it's like, well, we could get around to that later, which is almost as pernicious in terms of actually it should be a higher priority. One very interesting thing about Franklin's era is that there was no denialism. Everyone's just like, it's cold. It's too cold. It's colder than we know people were talking about in the Middle Ages, let alone further back. So everyone comments that they know that the Romans grew grapes and made wine in Britain. And everyone's kind of aware that that's probably not going to happen again. It is happening again. But the kind of consciousness that there was variation, not just in local weather patterns or short-term events, but longer term, by centuries or millennia. So I guess that's a kind of a messy answer, saying that a lot of the pieces in understanding climate change that we ought to be paying attention to have these older histories.
Yeah. Okay, so there's one piece here that I think is really important, which is your point that Franklin and his cohort, his contemporaries, are recognizing that there's climate change because they're colder than they think their predecessors were, but then they're also beginning to understand that there are things that are happening in the atmosphere which they may be contributing to. That's the beginning of this. But then there's something else that's happening too, right? Which is the question about resource depletion. And that they know they have control over. Like they know that's on them. There's no, invisible hand here or creator or whatever. So can you talk about the relationship between resource depletion and their attempt to create an indoor atmosphere?
Thank you, yes. Right. So parts of Europe have kind of run out of wood that they can use on a whim, let's just say, which means that conservation in this era was often done by ruling powers. Monarchs are very powerful people to sometimes preserve parks for them to hunt in, but often to preserve wood for building warships. It took, I kind of sometimes block out these statistics because it's just so astonishing, but like 1,000 or 2,000 trees to make a ship. And so this means in a war where you might want a couple of hundred of those, that's a lot of wood. And people are kind of aware that for national protection, especially during this second 100 Years' War, they really need to keep an eye on how many trees they have at any given point, including the colonies. So Great Britain is aware that part of the benefit of having places like in New England is having access to trees that can be used to build chips. Now, wood was being used for everything. It's sort of astonishing, before plastic or readily available kind of thin metals that could be used to create a number of things. They're using wood from everything from the garden shed to buckets, kitchen implements, building houses. So it's just a constant. It's always necessary in this period. And when it gets colder, this means that the cost of fuel just skyrockets or it becomes inaccessible. Everyone thinks Great Britain is so lucky for having all the coal that can replace this. And again, you think, you can see why they made that conclusion, but the longer term consequences are depressing. So yes, the conservation of fuel and a sense that people need to be more aware and more strategic for personal use, let alone national or kind of communal benefit. So yeah, again, they're squished. It's colder. They want to burn more wood. The wood is kind of vanishing.
It's always an astonishing thing. I remember reading Cronin's Changes in the Land and this great book about early New England and being astonished at that assertion that New England was basically deforested like by the 1660s. And it's like, what? What? That was fast.
Yes.
That was really fast.
Yes, Boston, for instance, runs out of wood like within a very short number of years of being settled. They just have nothing local to burn anymore. And there's an increasing trade from northern New England where there are still trees, but increasing expense in trying to get that down to Boston, let alone further south. There's already an import trade in coal, and this seems crazy, right? Coal is heavy, but worth it to import into the colonies when people don't have firewood. So yeah, it's a constant kind of headache. And the thing is, our energy use is so invisible compared with theirs. We don't have the big wood pile next to the house where we can see, oh, where are we in this year? Or the coal bin in the cellar that actually some people could have experienced in the 20th century. But everyone knows the cost, how much they're having to spend on fuel, wherever it would come from. And a lot of municipalities would have charitable outreach to give people firewood in very bad winters, lest they die of exposure in their own houses. So yeah, a constant preoccupation.
It's so interesting. So many questions, but I wanted to ask you about what it's like to write about one person and to write about that person from different perspectives at different moments in your own career, but also in the world at large. Like this book about Franklin as a climate scientist, I think lands in a particular moment. But I also remember when you were doing the edition of his autobiography in this moment of thinking about, how do we feel about the lone genius narrative, Like there was a kind of potency and poignancy to that too. So can you talk a little bit about what it's like to write about this character a lot?
Sorry.
No, in a good way, right? But from these very different vantages,
It's not just that I thought I was done with him after these other things, and here I come again. I had at one point told myself I'm never going to work on him because he was just too obvious. If I were the historian of science interested in early America, somebody waved the huge book by I. Bernard Cohen on Franklin and Newton at me, and I'm like, no. And it was in a seminar at Johns Hopkins when I was talking about working on the biography, which I hadn't thought of as a biography. And the first question was, in your biographical treatment, I thought, oh my God. And this has led to questions about whether I'm obsessed with him, which, I don't know, 3 books later, maybe there is space to that. But the thing is, I know too much about him to only admire him at this point, because he was kind of frighteningly ambitious. And people like that are not necessarily good to everyone around them. I mean, he did good things in the world. I want to stick up for certain of his projects, where, yes, that's very admirable. But people don't become rock star famous as he did in his lifetime without being kind of self-obsessed and not so interested in letting other people get the credit for the project. So time and again, if you look at his correspondence, you're looking at him working with a team, and then you realize he's the only person who walks away with the credit for that. Sometimes deservedly, sometimes not. So I always have that kind of, I know how he does it, and that's not necessarily admirable, but the impact that he had, you have to say, yes, this is how very ambitious people get some things done. I don't think I want to work on him again. I think, really, I say this now in front of witnesses. It's not going to happen. But especially for the science in early America, and this is what originally got me into Benjamin Franklin, that I wrote the intellectual biography of his life in science at a moment when science was beginning to be kind of criticized, including climate science, but a lot of other things. And I just found it completely ironic that one of the American founders was the person in science between Newton and Darwin, really. And I also think, okay, so the American founders, he's part of that pantheon. I maintain that if the American Revolution had never happened, he would be the only one of those guys anyone would have ever heard of. And so this is why when people went on and on about the founding era and what these people did, I was like, where's the science? And so that's why I wrote the original book about noting that one of the arguably most important founders, the one who brokered all the loans that supported the Continental Army and so on, and helps craft the peace and the recognition of the United States. These are not small accomplishments. But again, he was able to do that because of he was a celebrity and a kind of a pop icon in science at the time, which gave him a credibility in Europe no other early American had. So he was our founding scientist. I didn't know he was our founding climate scientist, which in some ways is really the ironies of our era. But yes, he really had this outsized contribution to all kinds of intellectual inquiry that are being disparaged in the United States now, which is not the outcome he expected, let's just say.
Okay, so just to go back to the point about climate science, can you just bring this together for us just a little bit? Because I think, most of us think about Franklin and lightning. We think about him at, his kind of atmospheric investigations, electricity. We think about some of his other explorations, but how do you bring all of that together in terms of climate? You gestured at this by talking about, his interest in controlling an interior climate, indoor space, basically. But can you bring that together for us a little bit?
He does. I don't know why he begins to imagine his sitting room, the family parlor, right, as the atmosphere, where he demonstrates how the air flows and where the heat is generated and how it goes throughout the entire room if you have a good stove. But he describes it as this flow of this invisible substance, air, within a closed atmosphere, a relatively new term and way of understanding the natural world, and all of this flowing through convection. And that is just such a fertile image for him that he uses it to describe everything. So he describes Atlantic storms moving up and down. He describes the Gulf Stream coming out of the Gulf of Mexico. And in that one, he says, just as the warm air would move from your fireplace to the door in your home. So it's that kind of domestic and very everyday image of how the natural world works that I think made it really kind of engaging. That, yes, you experience this every day in your home, heated by my fireplace. And that is exactly the way we can kind of imagine living within like a nested set of atmospheres, the small one being the room, the larger one being the local climate, and then the biggest one being the climate and the atmosphere, which again makes it seem as if we're at home any place in the world within these different atmospheres. And you can understand not only how they work, but obviously, implicitly, also your possible effect on them. And this is why when he sees all the coal smoke in London, he thinks, oh no, this is more real than I might have thought, right?
I was thinking about that great map that we have here at the JCB of Franklin's charting of the Gulf Stream and his obsession with the Gulf Stream, and is it remarkable? Okay, so one last question, then we'll open it up to our friends here, which is, why are there so few Franklin stoves left? I was at Stenton last week, outside of Philadelphia, and at Stenton they have a something Franklin stove. I don't know what it is, but I was like, wait, Joyce said there are no Franklin stoves left, and we had a whole long debate about what the heck it was stuck in their fireplace. Nice. So tell us about why there are no Franklin stoves and what it is they think they have at Stenton.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what they think they have at Stenton, because he had a design based on the work of somebody Franklin read. So it's part of the science of figuring out how you heat your room better. So unsurprisingly, during the Little Ice Age, everyone was trying to invent a better stove or adopt one. So I thought they had that earlier model. But here's the thing. When I say there's only one surviving one, it's the only one that survives with a connection to him, because it was done by the iron manufacturer to whom he made the gift of the model, Robert Grace. And it actually appears to be model 2.5. It's slightly different from what Franklin describes. It has modifications to accommodate stovepipe that's cast into the top plate. But it is based on him, on his model, including having the classic front plate that had a sun, a smiling sun in the center, and in Latin, alter idem, meaning another one. This is your heat source, not the big one, but the one indoors. So the design identifies it as linked to him. And there's one surviving partial plate that came from John Bartram's greenhouse. And that's it. All other Franklin stoves might be based on his design, and sometimes, it's hard to go to a museum with me because I'm always looking at what people claim, and I will not deface the little card on the wall, but sometimes it's a very inventive reading of whatever they have. So there are stoves based on his design, as with the ones in Italy. They are Franklin stoves, and some of those have a profile of him, for instance, or other indications that they understand the genealogy they belong to. But there are a lot. It's somebody else's model. Give them the credit, I actually think it's interesting that a lot of people were doing this, because frankly, saying that Franklin was the only person to be doing this is like saying Elon Musk is the only person to be working on electric vehicles. He's not.
Okay, Ben, it's not all about you. That's what we're saying. Okay, great. Okay, so we should turn this over to you all and any questions that you might have.
Not her. She's read the book.
Joyce, I've read the book and it's fantastic. Is this on? Yes. And thank you for writing it.
Thank you.
I learned a lot. I have so many questions, including what was Mrs. Franklin doing, and how did she feel about being cold one day, hot the next? She's full of soot. What's happening? That's not my question, though I think that would be fascinating to know. My question is, I was going to comment on the passage that you alluded to when he was packing up out of London with Peter. And you said something typically insightful and deceptively simple, which I will not quote, but it's something like that there were two kinds of fuel, right, that he was dependent upon. And later in life, he had different opinions about enslaving people. They were better opinions. And I wondered if the two ever crisscrossed. And the original notion of the stove was to use fewer trees, or perhaps stop using trees. Did he ever feel that you could industrialize without using humans? Did he ever tell other people he felt that way? Or was that just a personal sideline opinion of his? Thank you.
Thank you. And I do want to get back to Mrs. Franklin. But right, is an argument today in defense of continuing to burn fossil fuels that claims that if we need to keep doing that because if we stopped, we'd be plunged back into barbarism where we exploited each other. And this has a kind of kernel of historic truth. Before the Industrial Revolution, before that kind of motive power that steam could generate, most of the labor, most of the functioning of the world was accomplished through human labor. So a little bit by animals, a little bit by water or wind, sorry, that's the other one. But otherwise it's humans who are carrying, building, transporting, everything. And there's a growing discomfort in Franklin's era about the ugliest part of this, forcing people to work for you because you claim you own them. So that is a kind of turnaround and a turn away from the barbarism, as I'll call it. But what's interesting about Franklin and a lot of his contemporaries is that they never make an argument that, right, it's the steam engine that makes us think we could liberate people. And obviously, for enslaved Black people in the New World, they didn't need the steam engine to make an argument that they would rather not be in that position. And early abolitionism does not talk about that at all, including Franklin. He never makes that connection. Now we could do the following. So when he lives in London, for instance, he's called in as a technical consult for Boulton and Watt, who make the big famous steam engine that powers a lot of the early Industrial Revolution, to the irritation of a lot of technicians who, they send a working model to London, and a lot of other people are miffed, that it goes off to the American. But this means that he knows what's going on, right? It's not just that people are burning coal to keep warm and cook. It is generating power for bigger and bigger projects and could possibly replace labor. So it's not for lack of knowing what this could do, but he never makes that argument or that connection, which I think is interesting. He lives with both of these systems. He sees what he thinks as it becomes increasingly clear to him that one of them is wrong, and I agree with him. He accepts the other one, the burning of coal, and that one, you feel maybe he might have thought a little harder about that, but no one in this era was entirely clear about the damage that would be done. Mrs. Franklin, if there's any document that ever were to come to light, it would be her diary, that I would love. An inside view of what it was like to live with one of the world's biggest narcissists, who took the credit for everything. And anyway, I find it also interesting that he's inventing this better heating system during one of her pregnancies as well. And I don't know what disorder in the household it created to say, no, we're putting the steel plates in this way today. But she would have been a keen eyewitness, and later is involved in, she's the major person who builds their final house in Philadelphia. It's her job, including adopting a lot of new heating systems and accepting sort of some old ornamental versions as well. So she's doing this all, indicating that she probably had pretty good technical knowledge of her own about how that was done.
Thanks. My question's kind of a flip side of that because I want to think about the dark side of fossil fuel use. So as historians, it's really important to us to be aware of other possibilities, and we're always stressing contingencies. And I guess listening to you, I'm realizing that I just think of this switch as being so inevitable. And you're talking about looking back and watching them make the decision to use coal and thinking, oh no, don't do that. But I'm wondering, what do you think, even if they had known, was there an alternative? What were the other possibilities?
No, I hadn't meant to imply that there could have been another adaptation. I guess it's sort of my irritation about how gleeful they are about it, where, no one has a sense that that's a big trade-off. even as they're saying, God, London's air is filthy to breathe. I mean, they know that people are ill. It is bad enough. And they're increasingly aware, slightly after Franklin's death, that it's eating away, like all the old medieval cathedrals, et cetera. So what's it doing to people? What's it doing to other things? It's interesting. I'm just going to slightly move to the side. It's interesting that this is an American reaction. Go to London and marvel at the filthy air. Count Rumford, who despite his title is from Massachusetts, a loyalist who goes to Europe and gets this title along the way and is also a stove or a fireplace innovator. He just can't believe people live in London pretending like there's nothing wrong. So that sense of coming from places that have not made that switch yet and what is entailed when you do, again, there's some commentary. I don't think people are kind of completely oblivious. But for instance, Franklin advertises the fourth model of his stove in a French work that's by a coal entrepreneur. It's a sort of let's dig more of that up and burn it. And so that's where I think some of it seems a little under-thought out. I don't want to say that, however, without saying we do this all the time. What are we not? Kind of aware of the trade-offs in terms of what sustainable technology in the future may depend on, how that will be defined, what materials will be necessary for that. So I don't mean to stigmatize this era in terms of that transition, and I'll just finally say that it's not actually a complete transition. People, especially in America, keep burning wood even after they discover coal, even after they discover liquid petroleum. So the one thing that Franklin endorses that I think was kind of not good was increased population and consumption. That he was a proponent of growth economics. More. That's how the modern economy works. And I think actually there were objections at the time. He's a proponent, though. So that's probably the more dangerous part of it. Thank you for that question. Oh, invest in a factory. Not as such. It depends on what you think a factory is, though. And in this period, it would not have been the huge kind of operation of classical industrialization in the 19th century. The closest he comes is the collaboration with the iron operations in Pennsylvania. He goes through 3 different proprietorships, with the longest connection to the person he mentions in his autobiography when he's answering the question of why he never patented the stove. And he says, well, I don't think people should do that. He's meanwhile signed the Constitution that recognizes intellectual property, so kind of a complicated statement for him to make. He says he made a present of the design to his friend Robert Grace. And I'll just point out that Robert Grace had bankrolled his original print shop. He owed him in a way, and was his landlord during the period of time he was inventing the stove. So that was a collaboration in an early industrial operation where they are mining ore, making raw iron, crude iron, and then manufacturing it into commercial objects. And that was a scale of industrialization that was very, very common. Again, the huge factory operation, not yet the dominant model. But this kind of early industrialization was typical in the colonies and in Europe. And yes, Franklin was in some sense invested in that. Not as a primary investor, but certainly as somebody who put input into how they were going to make money. I don't know if you had another model in mind, though? Yes, thank you for mentioning that, because the Franklin stove was supposed to conserve wood, therefore trees, but of course the iron is made by massive numbers of trees, burned down into charcoal, because to make iron you need greater heat. It did seem that if you got a Franklin stove, it would conserve enough trees to offset that. But I go back to the problem of the growth economics. Pennsylvania is growing in population really fast. Everyone wants Here's the thing about having an entire artificial atmosphere. If you want a whole house like that, eventually that's greater consumption of the iron in the first place or the fuel in the fireplaces. Yeah.
Yep, one last. Yeah.
So within the Quaker history subgroup, there's a view that there's something kind of inherently theologically significant in the number of Quakers who become scientists and industrialists. And I wondered, do you see and I don't know if that's accurate. So is Franklin a counterexample, or is Franklin hanging out with Quakers in Philadelphia and Quakers in the UK and kind of riding with them and taking from them and working with them? Because, I mean, I know he cosplays as Quaker when he's in Europe. He dresses Quaker. They talk about him as Quaker. It's like he's like the Quaker Oats guy because of the reputation. So how do you see that? Or are the Quaker historians just being Quaker-centric?
Quaker-centric, and why not? I have to note that Franklin was, for a lot of his life and career, kind of not crazy about the Quakers in their politics in Pennsylvania. I do note, however, that a lot of the iron proprietors that he worked with were Quaker. So the person I just mentioned was married. Robert Grace marries into a big iron-making family that had been Quaker. A lot of those establishments were. The thing is, Franklin gets interested in science when he lives in London as a young man, when he kind of been in Pennsylvania for a month or so. He's more of a New Englander at that point in his life. He goes off to London, and that's where he thinks, wow, Isaac Newton. And he hangs around bars or coffee houses where Newton is reputed to go because he really wants to meet him. And that's where he catches the bug. So no Quakers involved yet when he thinks he wants science to be his ticket to prominence. I mean, he is very ambitious, and this is a way you can make a name for yourself that's quite new. The Quaker cosplay, I like that designation. That is the work of a French scientific contact who, in the introduction to Franklin's, the edition of Franklin's scientific works that's done in France, this is a man named Barbeau Duberg, who, in the wake of the 7 Years' War, realizes, are the French really going to like hearing about colonial Americans who just fought against them and defeated France? So he implies pretty heavily, he basically says Franklin is a Quaker, because that kind of takes him out of the military action. It's very cleverly done. It doesn't really hold up. I note that Franklin, for instance, was one of the delegates the Continental Congress tried to send to French Canada, formerly French Canada, to get them to join the revolution, and they're like, nah, no, we know who you are, and no dice. It kind of goes on, it depends on who in France knows a lot about him. I will note that the most famous portrait of him done in France, the fur cap portrait that's done right after he arrives, says born in Boston, né à Boston. So there's already a kind of awareness that he's not a Quaker from Pennsylvania in that classic way. But I think that that earlier work to say, well, he might be, in order to get more people to buy the edition in French, that has confused a lot of people. But no, he was not Quaker. We're not sure what he believed in. Going back to Mrs. Franklin, she was Church of England, and probably a lot of his moral thinking about religion came from that and from her. But yes, if he had faith in anything, it was himself.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you so much. So we have one more feature here before we clap for Joyce, which is that this is kind of a new tradition at the JCB, which is to give away books. We started doing this. I'm gonna switching microphones. We started doing this with Gordon Wood's event several weeks ago, last month, right? 3 weeks ago. And it was so much fun. And we thought, oh, we should do this if we're doing a book event. So anyway, so many of you were given a ticket or you took a ticket on the way in, yes? It may be yellow or orange or red. I hope so. Okay. So I have the joy of pulling one of these tickets. Okay, so yellow. It's yellow. If you have a yellow ticket. Got a yellow ticket? How many yellow tickets?
Only one person.
No, there has to be more. Yay,
there we
Tirana.
go.
Well, that makes me happy. Okay, so first of all, if you have a yellow ticket, or secondly, if you're a student, we have a book for you. Okay? Excellent. All right, so join me in thanking Joyce.
I like how Franklin ran a lot of lotteries in Pennsylvania. So
Right, there's a synchronicity to this. And join us for our reception also. Thank you all.